on the 0 Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow, and joining me now, and once again, is Ryan Grimm. Ryan is the Washington bureau chief for The Intercept. He is also the co-host of the program Rising, which can be found at, I believe, at thehill.com. Mm-hmm. Correct me if I'm wrong. So, yep, thanks for that correction. And he is, among other things, the veteran of a recent White House press conference where an awful lot of questions show what we might describe as a certain bias on the part of the White House press corps. I'm just going to come right out and say it before Ryan got a chance to get a word in edgewise. So we're just going to play a minute of that audio first before Ryan and I get to talking. But before we do, Ryan, of course, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me back.
All right, Troy, could you play that video, that audio, please?
Believe they need the most is more warplanes and fighter jets. So why is the U.S. assessing something different?
There were a few others like that, but basically that's the gist.
Why does the U.S. believe they know better what Ukraine needs than what Ukrainian officials are saying they need the most?
It sounds like, we're pretty dug in on our position when it comes to the no-fly zone.
Right, that's enough. But you get the gist. There was just question after question about why aren't we doing more militarily? Why aren't we sending more planes? Why aren't we putting in a no-fly zone? Until Ryan got to ask his question. But first of all, Ryan, sitting in that room, how did you feel? I mean, I know this has become a ritual with the White House press corps, but how does it feel to sit in the room when they're asking question after question exclusively about military escalation?
It feels psychedelic in a bad trip kind of way, and on one level, I'm also conflicted in the sense that you and I think both have said from the beginning of our careers that fake objectivity on the part of the press is problematic to the ability of people to kind of trust the media, and that people should admit to their biases, and then we can move on from there. And then you watch these particular biases play out, and you just want to say, well, okay, actually that was a mistake. Let's go back. Let's go back to the fake objective stuff.
Right. It's like a bad first date, right? I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's like a bad first date. Like, tell me what you really think about world events. No, please stop telling me what you really think.
I don't want to bottle that back up. Right. Good. Yes. Yeah. So, and there's it makes you nervous because the World War III involves everybody.
Right.
This is not a place where anybody has privilege beyond anybody else. We're talking the annihilation of humanity at an extinction level, potential extinction level event. So it makes you nervous that what is going on here? Why is there so much pressure being put on this White House to get into a direct military confrontation with a nuclear power? Today, an ABC News reporter at Biden's press conference, I'm not sure if you saw this, she asked, I know that you have ruled out World War III, but in hindsight, were you too quick to rule out direct military confrontation with Russia? And did that embolden Putin? And to Biden's credit, he just simply said no and no. But you watch these questions, you're like, if your question is, I know you've ruled out World War III, but if that's your question,
right. You've already gone wrong at but.
Right.
And I wonder about this. One of the reasons, obviously, I want to also talk about your question and the response, but one of the reasons why it's so disturbing to me is that, you and I have also, for the length of most of our careers, been critics of the way the press report and the mainstream press, and, clear biases in there and going to the same sources, beat sweetening, all this stuff. But this is maybe the first time, certainly the first time I can remember where I felt that the press corps, with that awesome responsibility, is just utterly, it's almost a kind of disassociative or fugue state where they just can't distinguish reality from, a kind of made for TV movie about impending nuclear war. Watching those clips, I just feel as if they don't understand they think this is a game. They think that no-fly zones are a game. They think that military conflict with Russian aircraft, shooting down Russian aircraft or what have you, that's a game, that is not, but that we're not potentially talking about hundreds of millions of deaths. And that seems like such a detachment from reality that it's kind of terrifying. Am I overreacting?
Oh, it's pretty terrifying. And you worry that perhaps we're too far removed from the Cold War, that people don't have a living memory of the existential nature of nuclear weapons, that there's some thought that maybe there's some tactical nuclear weapons or something that we could launch, and that wouldn't lead to an extinction level event. But it also feels like autopilot in some ways. And autopilot, and sometimes is the scariest of all, because it's like a lot of nuclear strategists have said, like, if we're going to wind up in a place where we annihilate ourselves, like, the chances are there's going to be some combination of misunderstanding and autopilot and poor reaction. And you can sort of see the press on autopilot and say, well, what we do is we find gaps between, X and Y, and we press the White House about that gap. And so their gap is you've got this heroic President Zelensky, who is, calling, making these emotional calls around the world for a no-fly zone and for other direct military help. And you have a White House saying no. And so the White House press corps has always seen its role as filling that gap, running into that gap. Like, he says he wants this, you're saying no. Why? And that, which is it's a fine question to ask, right, the first time, maybe the second time even, but for day after day, that the only question then becomes, why aren't you doing this? You have then become kind of a belligerent in the conflict.
And you've certainly become, it's so interesting because, Ryan, you and I aren't the only ones, I think, right now who aren't like struggling with our own recalibrating our own critiques of the press, but recontextualizing them. But it seems to me there's a difference between revealing your biases and becoming just a combatant. That doesn't it happen that after you've asked it so many times, now aren't you just like duking it out and you got your answer? You can convey your answer to the American people. You can even editorialize it. You think it's unsatisfactory or whatever. But once you got it, you got it. If you keep answering it, if you keep asking it, aren't you then just like boxing with the subject of your story, rather than being a reporter?
It does raise interesting questions about, what the role is here of the press. And, I try to be mindful of how I'd feel if the press were saying, look, the IPCC says that, if you hit 1.5 or 2 degrees, it's game over. And you're not on track to hit that.
Right.
And, or you said that you had reduced child poverty by 50%. Now you've increased it by 50% by letting the child tax rate. And trying to think how I would feel if they just
Right.
constantly hammered. But I think I would acknowledge, because when the press corps was doing it to Trump, even if sometimes I agreed with them, I could recognize that they had become combatants more so than media. Like the word media means something that goes through something else, and it is
That's true.
it's mediated. It's mediated on the way there. So that is the role that the media plays. It does shape things as it goes through, but ultimately our role is for information to go through, from somewhere to somewhere else. And often during the Trump administration, and now you're seeing it both around Afghanistan, not coincidentally, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and now they're not doing that thing where they're taking information from a source to an audience. They're just locked in a struggle with the source, which is not exactly the role.
No, and you see, I love your point, Ryan, about I should be thinking about that more. Well, how would I feel if my, issues were being hammered in the way that what I consider to be this disastrously wrong point of view is being hammered? And it is a thought exercise I think all of us in our profession should engage in from time to time. But I also wonder about the pattern of bias here, right? It's not like they ever do, in fact, like hammer our issues. They never do. And some people, I had a guest on the show last week saying, I don't want to be reductionist. And, my answer was, well, isn't the truth reductionist sometimes? So I struggle with this whole question, for example, of, you have people who say, well, the media is this way because the big weapons manufacturers fund all their networks or whatever. I think, that's too simplistic. That might be part of it, but there's more to it than that. But it does seem, you mentioned the coverage of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was never going to be good, right? Easy. And now we've got with this, it seems to me that there is a consistent bias for war. And I don't know if it's financially motivated, like the reductionists say, or whether it's because war just makes better copy than peace, or what the hell's going on here. But do you think what do you think underlies what at least I perceive to be a pattern here? And it ain't for us,
Jack, besides the bloodlust, Jack Schaefer had a good column in Politico about why, he was asking why it was that reporters were so in love with war. And one of the things he identified was a bias toward action and a bias toward vague action. Something bad is happening, Congress should do something. Somebody, the White House should do something. Somebody should do something. And what the something is often left to you figure it out, but you should do something. Like you got a problem. And so in a war, the thing you would do is more war. That's their bias toward action, rather than having a bias toward what are the off ramps here? How do you end this war? And curiously, maybe that feels to them too activisty. That if you're like pushing more war, that's just the direction that things are going, and it's what Zelensky is saying. At the same time, Zelensky's also trying to end this war at the same time. Right. So they could use the same frame and say, well, Zelensky wants X. Why aren't you pushing more to end this war? But that is more complicated. And also then it raises uncomfortable questions for them about, well, what are we going to do then? Or what are they going to do, with the Donetsk? What are they going to do with Crimea? Because then if you say, well, in a compromised negotiated settlement, maybe Ukraine recognizes Russia's control of Crimea, and then they're going to get accused of being pro-Putin or justifying his invasion. So it's just simpler to say, why haven't these planes are still flying?
And this So it's the default state, right? It's like the default state is more action of any kind, war, conflict of any kind. And to them, I think part of what you were suggesting is to suggest otherwise might feel like activism or advocacy, right? They're just reflecting reality, which is exactly the kind of autopilot escalation that the nuclear experts warn us about, the nuclear conflict experts warn us about. So let's go from there, Ryan Grimm, to your question, which deviated from that default state. You actually asked the question, as you mentioned earlier, we hear a lot about how Zelensky has asked for a no-fly zone, more airplanes, and so on. And the press doesn't talk too much about the problem of actually flying the planes in, which could be perceived as an act of war in and of itself. But he's also said he wants help with negotiation. He's also laid out some terms for negotiation. He's also said he's willing to pledge neutrality, as I understand it, no NATO membership, take that off the table. So as I heard your question, which I think the video went kind of viral, the question was, Zelensky says he wants negotiation. Why aren't you doing more for negotiation? Don't I have that about right?
Yeah, I said, what are you doing in order to, back up Zelensky's push for negotiations? And I think she had just handled 30 straight questions about why aren't you doing more war? And her first response to my question was, well, we have been the largest supplier of military weapons. And I think she was still in the answering the last 30 questions. And then she added, and humanitarian assistance and diplomatic assistance. And I said, so, would you empower Zelensky to lift sanctions on Russia as a result of a negotiated settlement? Because, since the sanctions were put there in order to get to a settlement. And she said she wouldn't answer that question directly. But I think it is a key question, because if Zelensky is not empowered to make those concessions, then he has a lot less power in the room.
Right. He's got nothing to trade with, right?
Right.
Ryan, you asked what I consider, I think was a two-part question in a way, right? The first was, and I don't think she answered either one, to be honest. I mean, I wrote to a friend of mine, said, wow, Ryan did a great job here. And they wrote back, and so did Jen Psaki. And I thought, what? Because I felt that first you asked, what is the U.S. doing to support negotiations? And you got a non sequitur answer. And I understand she might have been post-traumatic after 30 questions, whatever, but she didn't answer the question. And then the second question was basically, will you give Zelensky, the button that turns off sanctions? And she didn't answer that either. So if you agree with my assessment that she didn't answer either question, why do you think she didn't answer them?
I mean, from what I heard from people who would be, who would be sympathetic to the idea that he needs to be empowered, they would say, well, if you just blanket say in any and all circumstances that you're going to do that, what if he literally has a gun to his head? It's like, okay, yeah, all right, fair enough. Yes, obviously, if they kidnap him, which is not out of the question,
right?
That could happen, and put a gun to his head, then then of course, that's not the kind of ransom that we're not just meeting ransom demands. But I feel like it's pretty easy to determine whether or not that's the situation. The best rationale is just that the U.S. is just doesn't do that, just doesn't hand over its negotiating power to somebody else. But it raises a deep question of, do we have the same interests at play as Ukraine?
Right. That was the gist. That was what my question was getting to, right? Yeah. And do we?
I don't think we do. if we did, then the answer would be yes. Ukraine is our ally. We're a team here. Whatever brings this war to a close on the terms that Ukraine is comfortable with is acceptable, of course, to us. But if our goal is to bleed Russia dry and to cause them problems and to bog them down in an endless kind of frontier war, then those interests are very clearly clash with the interests of Ukrainians, who would be the ones suffering through that war.
Yeah, and I have to say before we go on that this argument that what if he had a gun to his head seems to me it's specious. It's like the ticking nuclear bomb, torture terrorists. It's super hypothetical. Yeah, okay, so you're right. It's so he doesn't have a gun to his head. He's not kidnapped. He's clearly that to me is specious. Right. But the other one I think does point to our differing interests, which gets to my next question, Ryan Grim, which is I'm trying to think of the best way to put it, but I'm sure you've heard, as many of us have heard, the commentary from Democratic centrist establishment as well as others, where people will say, what I see here is a years-long conflict where Russia gets bogged down in Ukraine the same way they got bogged down in Afghanistan in the 80s. And what they're really saying is, we want that. That's what I hear anyway, is that's a great scenario for us, because in Russia, we were bleeding them of resources and lives and we have, and of course, we know how the Afghan story played out 30 years later, but am I reading too much into it to say that if you believe in that zero-sum kind of approach to foreign policy, then that would be the logical conclusion from that you would people cause problems in countries' peripheries all the time. Like, there's certainly evidence that the U.S. Purposely caused problems in Xinjiang province. Does that justify a cultural genocidal crackdown by Xi Jinping in Xinjiang? No, of course it doesn't. But did the U.S. foment some disturbance there just to mess with China? Sure, there's plenty of evidence that they did. Right now, there's a massive refugee crisis in Afghanistan where the refugees are pouring into Iran. Are there some policymakers who are hostile enough to Iran that they're looking at that and being like, well, isn't that a shame? Right.
That there's now 1.5 million, Afghans pouring into Iran, and taking this very cold-blooded calculus that one country's misery, even if it's the hands of the misery of tens of millions of Afghans, is a good thing because it's a zero-sum world. Iran hurts a little bit, U.S. benefits a little bit, and so if that's your foreign policy view, and that is the foreign policy view of a substantial faction of the national security establishment here in Washington, then you do want Russia bleeding itself out. Now you have to be careful with these games that you play, even from their perspective, because what if it works out for them? What if they do seize the Black Sea, which they effectively have already, but if they can take control of Mariupol, then they'll have connected those breakaway states through there down to Odessa, that area. And all of a sudden, where Ukraine had controlled most of the Black Sea, now they've linked Crimea and all the rest of it, and they control the Black Sea, which also has these massive natural gas deposits. And so you may have, you've hurt them on the one hand. They've also then picked up massive resources on the other hand. Well, if they've captured Ukrainian nuclear power plants, they just have a complete strangleholding and could turn Ukraine into a third world country. It's
a dangerous game. It's kind of a real politic,
right? So it might suffer. Right? It might suffer on its own terms, but you are guaranteed that the function and the result is that millions of people are going to suffer.
And so, one of my takeaways is while this seems to have given the national security establishment in this country new undeserved credibility in the media, they beware the viewers. Don't kid yourself into thinking they necessarily have the needs of the Ukrainian people uppermost in their heart. Am I being unfair?
No, not at all. I don't think. Now, the problem that some on the left still have, though, is that they can't absorb all of this in their mind while not also saying that none of this justifies Putin's invasion.
Of course.
There's this funny American sensibility where you have one faction in the U.S., this media faction that says the reason that Putin invaded was that you took World War III off the table. You weren't right. aggressive enough, and that's why Putin invaded. Then you got another faction that says, you pushed NATO right up to the border and you forced him to invade. It's like, well, Putin decided to invade. Right.
No. And the war criminal is the one who made the choice to commit the war crime. I mean, that never gets. There's no.
And it doesn't justify American belligerence before that, which is another like.
Well, that's it, Ryan.
People seem to think that. Yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have to express it. Of course, Putin is doing a horrendous thing and deserves the, condemnation of the entire world. And there should be no question about that. But I feel like we're almost back in the Iraq days a little bit in terms of having an open debate, which is to say that we may have done things that contributed to the tensions. That's not for excusing him. That's not forgiving him. It's like if I don't lock my car and somebody steals it, that doesn't excuse a car thief, but I would have been better off locking the car, And to me, NATO expansion to the border states, breaking agreements, that increased tensions. Plus, Putin has lunatic ideas about, a Euro-Russian future or whatever. And so he decided to commit this horrific war crime. I think we can talk context, or we should be able to talk context without anybody thinking we're excusing that only one person made the decision to commit this horrendous crime, and it was Putin.
Right.
I'm sorry, that was a rant. I apologize.
That's exactly right. Because if it were reversed, and a lot of people say, well, the United States would, if Russia came in and armed Mexico and put Mexico into a defense treaty with Russia, then the United States would invade. And you know what? We in the United States who are on the left would condemn the United States doing that. Obviously, we would condemn that.
I've said the very same thing, by the way, in arguments. I've said, if Russia, you did that, then the U.S. would invade. And my friends have said, but that would be wrong. And I say, of course it would be wrong. We're not talking about that, but we have to be able to talk about superpower lunacy realistically and not assume that every scenario means you're morally endorsing the bad behavior of the superpower in question. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yes, and totally. And the recognition that both sides behave badly and dangerously is all the more reason not to escalate at any point, because it becomes so difficult to control. Like you remember the very beginning, it's like those of us who were saying, tamp this down, this could be a catastrophe. We were being told, nobody's calling for American troops to go into the Ukraine. Calm yourself down. Like, what's the big deal here? Well, now there are relentless calls for fighter jets and no-fly zones, and what was said at the time was, well, you don't know how these things spiral out of control, and that's why you got to keep them from spiraling. Keep them from starting because they spiral.
So before you go, Ryan, I mean, I think that's exactly right. You've talked about negotiations. Putin has talked about negotiations. Can you picture that happening? Can you picture Biden saying, okay, look, we got to do something about it. President Zelensky says he wants to negotiate. Let's let him negotiate. If he wants us sitting by his side as an advisor, I'll send, the Secretary of State or somebody. But, is there any chance we can actually wind this? I'm stunned more people aren't calling for negotiation. Is there any chance we can wind this down through negotiation and get it done?
It's going to have to. It seems like that's how it's going to have to end. And I think it's going to be painful because I think the Western public has a slightly contorted idea about how poorly it's going for Russia. It's going terribly for Russia. It's going differently than they hoped. Like they expected. They'd march in there, Zelensky would grab a bunch of gold and flee the country, and they'd put in a new regime. That didn't happen. On the other hand, they have seized enormous amounts of territory and, critically, linking up Crimea and other parts of the Black Sea. And so that doesn't get talked about much in the Western press. And so when Putin's demand is make it clear that there's going to be some de jure and some de facto control of these areas, that's going to be difficult for, I think, a lot of people to swallow because they won't be ready for it. Like, what are you talking about? And also because it just feels on a fundamental level unjust to allow a person a country to invade another country and then at a negotiated settlement to keep to that territory. That feels wrong.
To be rewarded, quote unquote, for it. Yeah. And I hate to say it, but it's probably going to hurt Biden even more politically, I would think. I don't think there's
another
a happy
Afghanistan, right?
Right, exactly. I don't think there's a happy end. And well, Ryan, you and I are supposed to live for historical moments like this when there's tons of news breaking and it's dramatic and it needs explanation. So I should be feeling a great sense of energy and fulfillment. But it's stressful, man. I'll just close on that. Yeah, I'll give you the last word. But
no, it really is. We could be headed into some very dark places, and the kind of reverberations from this when it comes to the different commodity price shocks people are going to be suffering through. Wheat prices, oil prices, I think you're going to see unrest, all over the global South at a minimum, and perhaps even places you didn't see it coming over the next 6 months to a year.
Great point, and also a terrible one. And we'll have to end because it's true. And we'll have to end there. But Ryan Graham, Washington Bureau Chief for The Intercept and co-host of Rising at thehill.com. As always, thanks for your great reporting. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks, RJ.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard, with more great news. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.